We have a question and a comment from some folks in the chat room that I think maybe we can start with. Ron C. asked a very straightforward question in association to the slide where you were talking about Canada's oil sands industry being, well, I think the tagline at the bottom of the slide was something like, the borders don't matter at all for the industry. He poses the simple question, don't tariffs impede flows? And I guess just building on that to try and push you a little bit, to what extent are we talking about different logics, or maybe just a more complex logic of the same, as there are state actors at both ends ultimately signing these elaborate contracts, treaties, arrangements? And so to what extent are you suggesting this is a more complex evolution of the same state logic versus an actual and new, a qualitatively different kind of logic?
So yes, Ron. So I think this is a really interesting question. We're already basically discussing, the point of entry and exit into this network, into this functional space, basically. Traditionally, we used quotas and tariffs. How many goods can cross the border, and for what price? Today, when custom officers, when I attend, for instance, the World Custom Conference, the PCALT conference, and I've done this for a number of years now, the question is actually not exactly what's going to happen at the boundary line in the warehouse, which is the way we were doing this until the 80s. And it's the way actually it still is conceived by Brexiters today, even though they don't have the infrastructure to actually deal with the trade that they are doing, right? Because I can discuss this more, but they don't. But what the World Custom Conference discusses when they discuss this is, how do we implement this into fairly large production operations on computer softwares? So the point of entry and exit into the network is written in the production process. So when you renegotiate, the large framework agreements, like a free trade agreement, and that you have some tariffs or you have some quotas, you also have specific exceptions or accommodation to all of the different areas. And that's where it's negotiated. That's how it basically happens. You push the boundary line into a regulatory system that is taking place in the place of production. And I think this is exactly what we have to study. We have to see how far it can go. Yes, it is not for everybody. So I'll add this part, right? Is that if you are a small size business and you haven't operationalized, you haven't implemented all of your production, let's say, into a large spreadsheet or across a software that is sophisticated enough to actually, calculate for you how much of these goods mean tariff for that country or that country or that country. You all do this with paper slips, custom slips. So I'll go in the detail about Brexit. The UK today trades 255 million custom slips per year. The capacity today in the UK is 55 million. Everything else is done by private agents that are located in the Netherlands, in Belgium, or on the continent. Most of the warehouses, so for the ones that are all electronic, obviously Brexit is going to be okay because they can, the largest manufacturers, the largest traders are going to be able to operationalize this through software transformation. So they adapt the rule of law into a software number. They just adapt what they have to pay or the flow and so on and so forth, and it's all recorded. But for the average millions of people who are smaller, it's going to be a nightmare for a number of years. And it's well identified by parliamentary reports in the UK. They know it's going to be a huge nightmare. And it's also going to be a huge nightmare for agencies and state departments, state and agencies across the UK. The data that I have on this is that at least 100 agencies and departments will be affected by Brexit just for the custom function. Because we're talking about millions of types of goods that are going in and out of the UK. That will not be just electronic transformation of software for the large traders and industrial producers. So it's a huge issue. Please.
Thank you.
I've read this common wisdom: anything in life is easier to get into than to get out of. So this Brexit now is more and more is discovered of what you described, the huge nightmare that will be for almost everyone. Is it reversible, the Brexit itself, or has it gone too far?
Frankly, I don't think it's reversible.
Okay.
Not anymore. No. But, you never know. Politics is full of surprises.
Well, a Brexit no deal Brexit isn't really Brexit at all, because what it really is the UK adopting all the rules that the EU has implicitly, because there's nothing that replaces it, so they just have to do whatever the EU
They can
is doing.
step out and basically implement upon themselves the GATT rules. And then the EU, and then all of their clients in the EU will be able to impose, as the question was, EU tariff, which will cost them way more than it used to cost them to trade with the UK, the rest of the European Union. That's the disaster.
Well, such a thing won't happen overnight.
It will affect Canada, for instance. A Brexit no deal would have an impact on our ability to trade with the rest of the EU. It will affect the whole world economy. It will. It will have an impact because it makes, in a way, the UK a traffic jam for all trade going through the UK, which is a large economy.
That's precisely why the UK won't be able to do that. They will implicitly and immediately have to adopt everybody else's rules and just follow along. Maybe over a substantial period of time they'll be able to implement some national type rules, but it'll take a long time.
Let's see. Yeah.
Well, let's not see. Let's don't have a no-deal Brexit.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with that.
What is your interpretation of the commercial, legal, diplomatic blockers between USA and China? How do you interpret that?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because I think what we have there is basically a renegotiation of some of these functional borders. Right? We have a rediscussion of the condition under which certain functional borders that have to do with trade flows, organized trade between so it's the structure of the functional borders between the US and China that are being rediscussed. We do not focus so much on those negotiations as we focus quite a bit in the media on the consequences of the lack of negotiation, right? It's imposing sanctions and imposing more tariff and making it more difficult to trade, which means building walls. The issue with this is that in today's world, it's walling yourself out of the world when you impose tariffs. Think about it this way. You're trading a lot in your neighborhood. You buy and sell all kind of things, let's say and suddenly you're refusing your clients to walk in. I mean, the best way to think about it is this. I have a bar, and I have 50 regular customers, one of which consumes maybe 15% of all my liquor. And I've decided that just because I don't like that person, I'm going to call that person China. I'm going to raise tariffs, the cost of everything that China buys. What am I doing? I am building walls and I'm making it more difficult for China to trade with me, but I'm making myself much poorer at the same time, very, very, very quickly. So when you renegotiate these borders, which are regulatory functions, right, you actually are also connecting yourself or disconnecting yourself from the rest of the world. The visibility of it is not that you're building a wall onto a territory, but you're making it much more difficult to trade. I think that's a really counterintuitive idea, but it's exactly what we have, right? So China and the United States right now are renegotiating basically the point of entry and exit into these networks, these functional networks of trade. Point of entries that they may want to make freer or harder or more expensive or less expensive, but they can't really agree what the cost should be. Once they agree on things, then they have a new, in a way, level playing fields to compete with each other. Now, the counterintuitive part, I think, is that for the longest time, these negotiations were done by treaties, but their material, physical, the connectivity that we had, the way we saw how it happened concretely at the point of entry into the territory. It's the warehouses in airports and seaports, primarily, where you actually have the goods sitting in warehouses, and where you count the good and you calculate how much it costs and how many goods can come in. But the borders of globalization and these regulatory networks are basically making these warehouses less necessary, right? Because it's done at source. It's done before the good leaves China. So I think that's kind of a fundamental transformation of, in a way, the function of the boundary line and the way we do custom trade. We don't just do custom, trade. We also do human data and information trade. But that's a representation of it. That's the counterintuitive part.
The idea of new borders forming around these trust communities is really interesting, and related to the China question, it reminds me of the United States or the Western countries in general treatment of the Huawei competitor threat and how they've reacted to, almost securitizing this commercial competition. And I would just point out too, Ron followed up with a statement putting his finger on nationalism, saying nationalism leads to tariffs, impeding trade flows, and leads to anti-immigration, impeding migration flows.
Yes. So I think, okay, indeed, nationalism can lead to both, but there is a major, I think, difference between the two areas. When you think about trade, you can think about free trade as long as you don't touch the mobility part. That's kind of what the EU has done since inception. Increase trade, control your populations. Schengen is an illustration of this. Schengen and Dublin are actually illustrations of these rules, right? It's that you want to control mobility, but you're okay with the idea of, in a way, increasing trade flows. And nationalism, in a way, that doesn't have the same kind of influence on both. It may influence trade, but traditionally, at least recently in the last 15 years, it's been much more prominent since 2015, especially in Europe, but also in North America. It's been much more prominent in influencing national mobility policies, welcoming foreigners and the kind of things that we do with this, whereas trade has become freer. Brexit here is an exception. So Brexit is an interesting case from that very perspective, where basically we discover that free trade is not the same thing as free migration policies. Because in the case of Brexit, it was, they are coming, they're invading us, pointing to, you know, migratory policies within the EU as a factor of threat to the UK. So I think we have to be careful when we link the idea of mobility and flow, because they are not exactly they're not dealt exactly from the same perspective by nationalist movements.
Just to clarify, when you say the difference between mobility and flow, are you dividing that at mobility is associated with people and flows are associated with everything else?
Yes.
Could we not speak of mobility of goods and flows of people? Or
We can, but I think it's better to not use the word flow for people. I think it's a bit pejorative. Whereas I think mobility, human mobility, is something that is well established, that the world of humans has always been somewhat mobile, and even Foucault discusses this, that, you know, there is the age of mobility and then there is the age of, anyway, so.
Another way to think about that is that anything can have mobility, whether a person or a good, whereas systems have flows. But I'm not sure if that's different. And then the question of connectivity. So we have these three words. How does connectivity, is that sort of an umbrella category?
Yeah, connectivity is the umbrella category that would bring together the technologies that allow for mobility and flow, the technologies that filter mobility and flows. Both obviously have a foundation in the rule of law and regulatory agreements. But I don't know if that's what I was pointing to when we discuss security. Can we use the same technologies to basically identify goods and identify humans? I think this is a big question. And if we have connectivity technology for humans, is there a human dimension to this? That is really important.
But isn't it 100 years old in the passport? Doesn't that infrastructure, it's a matter of political will, and this is where nationalism and identity and trust community comes into it, but the technological capacity is there?
The passport, although is the beginning of identifying individuals out of the community, but the passport primarily is actually you're part of a community that has the right or not to come into our territory. Right? Passports require or not visas. So if you have a British passport, you can go to many more countries than if you have a French passport. If you have a Canadian passport today, you can go to many more countries than if you have a passport from, let's say, Yemen. But today, the technology allows us to identify people, individuals, and individual goods, one by one. That is a very big difference. And it can create, as a result of this, a multitude of exceptions. You can say, for instance, every red good is forbidden, but these 250,000 ones are allowed. So the categories are completely different. It's not a blanket, it's not the passport from a given country allows you to go to those countries. It's that whether or not you have a passport is disregarded. Those individuals with these very specific categories that are, let's say, 15 different parameters identified in an algorithm will have the right. So this is, for instance, what China is doing now, right, with these this coefficient of citizenship or good behavior that allow you to move.
Ron just pointed that out in his comment as you're speaking.
Exactly. And so this is a very important one, because where is the boundary line? Well, you know what? It depends. And I think that's really important, because if we have the technology to do this, we have developed it because we want to control flows of goods. Fair enough. But now we're actually implementing the exact same technology, disregarding the fact that we're dealing with humans. Now, maybe democracies will allow this, but I hope democracies will regulate this to defend human rights. Yet, we have many colleagues who are really concerned about this, starting with Agamben, right, who has identified 15 years, 20 years ago, that there were issues even in democracies with regard to the respect of human rights because of biopolitics. And I think we cannot disregard this, right? Technology and biology, unified into one, allow us to identify each one and every individual and treat them very differently according to what Rob Walker calls a vertical piano, right? Not the horizontal piano, which has, you know, broad categories, but the vertical piano, where you have, you know, a multitude of items that you can use to basically filter who goes there and create multitudes of subcategories, right? Which is, I think, a real issue, because these are the borders that we're creating today, functional borders beyond territory, beyond these big categories, such as, you know, being part of a nation and having certain rights worldwide being rewritten.
So what are the ethics implications of all these transformations, if you have some ideas?
I don't know if I can really discuss the ethical implications. For border studies, I think it means, you know, it means that we need to rethink. The one thing that I come back to all the time is human rights and charters of human rights, and how come, you know, there is so much slippage around Charter of Human Rights, and why is it that information communication technologies, in a way, are uniformly applied to all categories as if humans were good. That's the one thing that I'm thinking about. So as we are developing this new knowledge about functional borders and their spatiality, the aterritorial part, we're also discovering that the technologies that are basically managing these new categories are the same for goods and people.
Well, on a different train of thought a little bit, but with regards to the human rights aspect, I'm kind of curious about how, like, the enabling that flow or the mobility, that makes sense. Like, you have documents or tools in place to enable that, but when it comes to enforceability, based on the terms that, you know, everybody agrees to, that's where things seem to get a little bit sticky without being attached again to a territorial aspect. So I think of the EU's GDPR. So it's, you know, transcends nations, and Canada is subject to
Spell it out for everybody.
the General Data Protection Regulation.
Thank you.
So it's supposed to be everybody who deals with EU citizen data has to comply with this regulation. And there's quite substantial penalties, like it's 5% of a company's, I think, their annual profits. So if, for example, they're in breach of privacy or any other things. But then when it comes to actually holding individuals or organizations accountable for those violations, how, if they don't want to comply with a court order or whatever decisions made, then, you know, how exactly outside of the EU does that occur without the willingness of those organizations? And there's even a stipulation that under the GDPR, for those organizations who do enough business with EU citizen data have to have a body or somebody in the EU. So it's kind of linking again to that, you know, in order to have any enforceability, that kind of territorial, you have to geographically reside here.
Yeah, territorial anchorage. That's what aterritoriality doesn't mean that you don't have a territorial presence, but it means that you're transnational in nature, and that the regulatory system that superimposes itself on you is also transnational. So the EU, to a certain extent, in that case, right, is not really a transnational body. It can only work with other state or even private sector bodies to implement that rule, and that's its weakness today.
Right.
The thing is, though, I think in global law, a lot of these mechanisms are already in place for flows of goods. We don't have the similar complex set of laws, if you want, with regard to mobility. We actually are not able to develop this, the 203, the 2 compact, that have to do with human mobility and migration they are stumbling on this. They are unable to, have blanket agreements. We are not reaching this. I think that when it comes to flows of goods, there is much more of at least pan-regional, broadly speaking, agreements with regard to trade. So when it comes to trading human data, for instance, the ability to develop transnational organizations that would then have reach around the world. We also have to look at, so the way I look at the question that you just raised is that you also have to look at innovators like the EU in this regard, trying to show other states how you can do it and maybe even influence. They start at home, but eventually they can influence other areas, even the private sector. It could be that private sector regulators, for whatever, for market credibility, may want to develop similar standards, even before states, because it may give them a greater reach around the world. And it may give them credibility. When you have let's say when you have 2.3 billion customers, maybe you want to have that credibility.
And you're filling a vacuum, potentially.
Right.
There's nothing in existence.
Maybe you don't want to have that credibility, and until you have maybe 400 or 500 million of your customers that are going to say, unless you have that system that protects us, we're not going to play the game anymore. We're closing our accounts.
Does that protector always have to be a state in the end?
Well, in the past it was the Leviathan, right? So it was always a state. Today, that's the point I'm trying to make, is that we're renegotiating this across transnational actors. They're not international actors, they're transnational actors. They don't have to be just states. They can be cooperative agreements. They're transnational actors. They can be non-profit, they can be private sector, they can be states. They can be coalitions of those. They can be different. And it will vary according, this is why I conclude with this idea of, multiple, like various variable geometry and complexity. The governance is really quite complex because the kind of actors that are influencing the various areas, functional areas, can vary greatly as well. We think through the state, and we discover that there are many other stakeholders in the way that are very influential as well. Please.
Can you comment or even analyze the Trump's Muslim ban in the context of these trusted communities and the evolution of borders and the interplay between his nationalism and liberal democracy in the United States?
Trump cannot be analyzed.
I don't want to go there.
You could just say case in point. There's
Yeah.
I'll say something that you might find counterintuitive. I have done interview work with people who are originally born in Muslim countries, who are at the highest of security clearance in the United States and have tremendous influence on the development of the different sector of the security industry in the U.S. So it's full of contradictions there.
Yes.
Right? Also, there are lots of security agents in the U.S. that, post 9/11 were told, well, you're not going to have this job unless you speak Arabic. So, we have all these different facets to these big nationalist questions. How do you deal with this when you don't have the specialists? And who are the best ones? So this is the whole point. All that the border culture teaches us is that these kind of broad categories that we used, in the 1900s and post Second World War all the way to the late 1970s, like, skin color and all of these are being deconstructed for algorithms that are way less sensitive to visibility or visible things, right? So the language you speak, the color of your skin, your religion, your sense of belonging, all of these are kind of immaterial. They become much more, they filtered through behavioral data, basically, and behavioral accountability, which is very, very different way of looking at what allows you to belong to a network. Look at the case in China, for instance. Yes, in China, with regard to certain populations, the fact that you are a member of that subgroup is a major impediment. But many, let's say, Manchu may also be associated or with ratios that are poor as being Uyghur, for instance, from the northeast, from the northwest, right? So the algorithms there are really important, and they have to do with behavior and what the state can observe. That's the way it works in China. But see, once again, I mean, these are, in a way, these two technologies that, there's the technology of the information communication superimposed onto a territory, but we're not looking at enough. We're not disconnecting this enough from the worldwide, the global pressures that I think we studied that are quite interesting for borders and globalization. Yes?
For me, the really interesting thing is the shift from international to transnational, or international to the global, if you like, when it happens, and to what extent the transnational is really independent of the international, or sort of operating with the blessing of the Leviathan. To what extent can any of these transnational organizations, institutions, actors be revoked with the stroke of a parliamentary pen? In that sense, is it really sort of a play transnational? Or where do we see examples where it's become completely sort of unmoored, if you will? And one area I was thinking about for security, and I'm not sure if what work might have looked at this question, but private security firms like of the Blackwater sort, or some of these big corporations that provide security. Maybe their corporation is based in New York or London, but they're providing security, and they're not actually accountable to a particular state. And they may be providing security, maybe their contractors are other states, but maybe they're also being contracted by big corporations to provide security. So here's an interesting example where you have new dimensions of world security in completely private hands, unaccountable to any public sector.
They're accountable to their clients, many of which are states. So there still is territorial anchorage there.
But they might be employed by Shell.
Yes, they may be, exactly. So we have very little data on this. We study boundary and cross-border regions. We don't study these functional borders and the renegotiations of these agreements worldwide, right? So that's why I say the future of border studies. This is why, I have this last slide here, where I see we need to look at the new mobile border logic. So, I mean, I call it new mobile border logic, but actually looking at transnational regulatory issues, because they're transforming completely the way we board the world. It's point of entry and exit into the global world, basically. How we connect non-contiguous, areas. And how far can we go, as you said? Can we even picture these regulatory agreements being completely unmoored from states? Legally speaking, Benjamin told us it's feasible. They may have multitude of anchorage, but they are not accountable to no states. They'll still be accountable to their customers. That's why I was saying, that it's possible that for market reasons, you might want to have the best possible standards rooted in human rights protections or whatever.
And even security, actually thinking about that, there is a standard across, there's multiple nations that come together and have established a security standard that now governments require any contractors or service providers. And so I feel like it trickles out, and then, so if that's the standard, then other private actors will also insist on the same standard being used when they hire on for security.
Yeah. So when we look at the work that Simon Dalby did, and we look at especially this slide, this is one of the things that Simon is in a way defending in his work, is that he's saying that understanding basically these Anthropocene boundaries and the technological part behind them is just as important, because it can be that those standards will trickle down through a recognition across not just states, but across many different actors in the private sector and the non-profit sector, and trickles down, and in a way the snowball effect then becomes amazing. Right? So
we're getting down to about 5 minutes here, but Ingrid Strauss had shared an announcement that I'll just very quickly refer to here, and anyone can contact me to get the details. The Columbia Basin Transboundary Conference. There's some scholarships being offered for post-secondary students and nonprofit professionals who are interested in attending this conference. If you are, I've got some more details here. Did anyone else who maybe hasn't contributed yet want to make an observation or raise a question? I have another internet question from Ron. That's very, very specifically, did Zuckerberg or Sandberg, I think these are both big social media technology guys, ever appear before a parliamentary committee in Ottawa? And if not, here's a case of lack of cooperation by a transnational private sector entity.
absolutely. And one of the things that I found amazing, and I watched the entirety of the interview in the US and in the EU, is the level of information in the EU was so high across the different MPs on that committee that they got upset with his answers, because he was basically telling them whatever. And I watched the whole thing because it was not so long, and I thought, it's worth it. I have to really know these things carefully, right? So what are they asking him, and how is he answering, and so on and so forth. And so the lesson that I had from that is that elected officials don't even conceive, now it's changed in the US, but when they started, they did not even conceive, did not even understand the reach and the power of these new information communication technologies worldwide. They can shut you out at any time. They have the power of a state. How many friends do you have worldwide? Let's say you're a media figure, you have 10,000 friends worldwide or 200,000 friends worldwide, and tomorrow we shut you out. Well, think about it for a second. You are gone. What are you going to do against them? You have no recourse. When a state does this, you have administrative law, and you can go to specialized tribunal, like human rights tribunals and all kind of tribunals, to actually make your case. But in this case, nothing. You're a non-existent entity, basically. So I totally agree with you. But legislators are not aware of this. Maybe they are today. They were not when they interviewed him in the US. And in the EU, they were really upset because they thought that the level and the quality and the thoughtfulness of the answers were really below par. One of them actually lost his school. I don't know if you've seen that in the media, but there were one or two, I think it's a German MEP, a member of the European Parliament, who basically said, what is this, right? And he became like all in English, flustered, and was asked by the chair of the committee to keep his cool. So I think it's really a good point, is that these new functional boundary line, if you want, or borders, we can't call them boundary line, these new functional borders, we have to understand them more, we have to study more, because they are not territorialized, we dismiss them. But actually they have tremendous impact on us. They're changing the world we live in, completely. And again, as I was saying, I think that studying them from the perspective of goods and flows of goods and the perspective of human and human mobility, well, should be two different ways. We should have two very different operationalization of our research. We cannot accept, I don't think we can accept the idea that we should use the same technologies for both. But today, as the security industry shows us, we are using the same technology. We're implementing the same technologies. We're implementing technologies of identification, like code bar, onto humans with biometry. That means we can select to the infinity any human being and include them or exclude them for whatever reason. Anyway, thank you for the questions, and thank you everybody for the questions.